My child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way, but there were planes to catch and bills to pay. He learned to walk while I was away, and he was talking for I knew it. And as he grew, he said, I'm gonna be like you, Dad. You know I'm gonna be like you. Please be seated. We learn from what we see, and we learn from what we hear. I have a great dad, and he learned from what he saw and heard from his dad. My dad saw his dad work hard at the office all day while his mom worked hard at home. And my dad saw his dad come home every night and sit down in his easy chair and read the newspaper. And he knew not to bother him. He'd had a hard day. I don't know how that made my dad feel. I've never asked him, but I wonder. I don't know if my dad ever questioned that way of things when he became a dad, if he knew that things could be different. I don't know if my dad looked up at his dad and said, I'm going to be like you, Dad. You know I'm going to be like you. But at least in this one way, he was. My dad would come home from work, and after dinner, he would sit down in his easy chair and read the newspaper. Now, when I remember him in that chair, I remember feeling three things: love, admiration, and distance. And I remember I didn't question it. I didn't ever think, hey, you know, Mom's been working pretty hard too. When does she get to sit down and rest? And how does she feel about this? And does she get a choice here? When I was little, I didn't ever wonder if there could be a different way. I just assumed this is what it meant to be a dad. And so wired into my brain, without me even knowing it, are Harry Chapin's words. I'm going to be like you, Dad. You know I'm going to be like you. Now, 21 years into being a dad, I hope I've learned a few things. One of the things I know I've learned is that there are so many ways that I am glad I am like my dad, and there's some ways I wish I was more like him. I've learned that my dad, in his own way, for his own time, embraced some and rejected some of what he had seen and heard from his dad, that he was learning how to be a dad too. And that was a different time. And we all grow into roles incredibly imperfectly. And I've learned that when I come home from work, part of me still wants to plop down in a comfortable chair, rest, and not be bothered, and feels like I've earned that, and isn't interested in thinking about the effect on anyone else or me. This narrative of fatherhood I grew up with, it has shaped me. And I have learned that sometimes old narratives exhaust their usefulness, and this is one of them. Yes, there were good things about it, values of love and admiration, and yet the ways it has been unhelpful and harmful, creating distance between parent and child, reinforcing demeaning and toxic gender and power relationships, all this means that it's time for a change. We need a new narrative for fatherhood, for parenthood, for family, one that suits what we have learned and are still learning about gender roles, sharing power, and human development. One that takes what is good of what we have seen and what we have heard and leaves the rest behind. One that coming generations can look to and say with pride and joy, we're going to be like them. Yeah. You know, we're going to be like them. We learn from what we see, and we learn from what we hear, and that's also true about the stories we tell. When we only tell stories of warrior men and damsels in distress, boys and girls grow up with an ingrained sense that this is who they are supposed to be, and non-binary and trans kids grow up wondering if there's a story for them at all. And those stories can become prisons for everyone. Now, often these stories have been told for a long time, are deeply meaningful, and have served an important purpose. But we reach a point where old narratives exhaust their usefulness, where toxicity and trauma they perpetuate outweighs the good, where we need to tell the story in a new way that preserves the good and yet fits the many ways our understanding of ourselves and the world is evolving. And this morning's gospel is one of those stories. For nearly 2,000 years, we have told the tale of Mary as Virgin Mother. It has deeply impacted how we see God, ourselves, and one another. It is a story that has spawned glorious art and music. And yet, because of its power and how the images have been used, particularly against women, it is time to look at whether this narrative, as it is written, has finally exhausted its usefulness. Whether we need a new way of telling the deep truths of this sacred story. Now, the first thing we have to realize is this story was always meant to be metaphor and never meant to be history. Never. The virgin birth doesn't even appear in the earliest gospel or any of Paul's letters. The two places it does occur later, Matthew and Luke, were written specifically to convince Jews and Greeks, respectively, to accept the authority of Jesus' life and teachings. And that's why they tell Jesus' birth story this way. You see, miraculous birth stories were common in Jewish and Greek traditions. Virgin and other miraculous birth stories were told not only about gods, but about people, including Alexander the Great. So this was a way to say to Jewish and Greek audiences, what happened here was special and wondrous, that Jesus was right up there with other gods and heroes of the time. Now, this metaphor also worked because it jived with a first century understanding of biology, where the woman's role in pregnancy was as passive and fertile ground for the male seed, and with a social expectation that women were property to be used sexually by men, and of course God was seen as a man, for procreation and men's pleasure and control. Well, it's 2019, and we recognize now that that understanding of biology is preposterous. And that understanding of gender is impoverishing and destructive. The metaphor is worse than useless. Holding to the dogma of the virgin birth does not convey importance, but instead such a deep denial of reality that it puts the story of Jesus' birth on par with Athena leaping from Zeus's head in terms of stories we need to pay attention to today. Worst of all, it is contrary to the story's deepest truth. The truth expressed at its heart, and the child will be named Emmanuel, a name that means God is with us. The beautiful, poetic truth worth saving and retelling for ages to come is what we say every time we gather here at All Saints Church, that God dwells in us, in everyone, that God dwells in you. That Jesus, born in a body, from the joining of bodies, is sacred. That our bodies, all of our bodies, are good and holy, and that God dwells with them and in them. God dwells in us, in you, not in spite of who you are, but because of who you are. The original writers of Matthew's gospel got it right. The truth of Jesus' birth is so important. The truth that God longs for us and is with us in the most intimate ways is healing and life-saving. And for nearly 2,000 years, the way we have told this story has had wounding and deadly consequences. We learn from the stories we tell. We become the stories we tell. And because of that, for nearly 2,000 years, as we have told a story of the pinnacle of womanhood being the impossibility of a virgin mother, of sex being something not holy enough for God and therefore somehow dirty and shameful, of women being the property of men for our control and pleasure, because of that, for nearly 2,000 years, we have told a story about God queering the boundaries between divinity and humanity with no role at all imagined for people or families who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or queer themselves. We have powerfully and tragically said that God is in fact not with you, at least not as you really are. The story of God having to avoid the most wonderful embodied parts of what makes us human in order to be with us has long exhausted its usefulness. And on behalf of a church that insists on holding on to this story long after we recognize the truth, if this story has made you feel any shame about your body or your sexuality, if this story has made you feel any less than one in and with whom God dwells beautifully as you are, I deeply apologize. And yet apologies are not nearly enough. For the deep truth of Emmanuel, of God with us, is worth saving and telling again and again and again. And it is time for a new narrative, a new way of telling the deep truths of this sacred story. Now, our young people are way ahead of us on this one. They have been doing this here for years. Our Christmas Eve pageant has recently featured Mary standing up to Gabriel, arguing about a woman's right to consent to what happens to her body. Now this year, you got to come this year. This year, our young people will explore Mary's worthiness of being revered, not being because of some supposed and imposed purity, but because of the earthiest, most courageous parts of her humanity. Last Sunday night at the Advent evening service, as some members of the Trouvères preached about different opinions about the gender of God, one of our young people, Willa Caspol, prophetically castigated the church for being far more concerned with Mary's virginity than her maternity. The journey to a new narrative has already begun. Our young people are leading the way, and thank God. And yet, ironically, perhaps the most appropriate new narrative for our day is almost as ancient as the gospel reading we heard this morning. You see, in the 2nd century, the Christian scholar Origen spoke out against a rumor that was going around that Mary had been, and here's what he said, turned out by the carpenter who was betrothed to her, as she had been convicted of adultery and had a child by a certain soldier named Panthera. Now, this rumor was circulated by early opponents of Christianity to discredit Jesus, to say that far from miraculous and important, Jesus was the result of Mary having sex with or even being raped by an unclean Roman soldier. The story was meant to discredit Jesus and shame Mary. But what if instead we told a story like that with pride and joy? What would it mean if the story we told was of God dwelling in us through a woman who decided that she was going to have sex with someone she'd fallen in love with, rather than someone her father had given her to in a business transaction? That holiness is about God being with us in sexuality freely and mutually celebrated. What would it mean if the story we told was of God dwelling in us through a woman who was a victim of rape in a world that said, and still too often says, that sexual assault is always the woman's fault? That holiness is about God being with us, not in some imagined state of purity, but in our deepest trauma, and in those times where the world has utterly cast us out. What would it mean if the story we told was of God dwelling in us through the adopted non-binary child of two women? That holiness is God being with us beyond our imaginary boundaries of gender or outdated and toxic notion of what makes a real parent or a real child or a real family. What would it mean if the story we told was not, Joseph did not have intercourse with Mary until she had given birth, but Joseph and Mary had sex? And sometimes they enjoyed it, and sometimes they didn't. And sometimes one of them enjoyed it, and the other not so much. And sometimes they didn't have sex for a long time, but they thought they were the only couple that was going through that, so they didn't share it with anybody. And they talked and sometimes argued about sex, and they were attracted to other people sexually and had to wrestle with that in their relationship. And then along the way, Mary became pregnant, and maybe it wasn't what they were planning, and maybe it even terrified them. And they made a choice to keep the child because they decided that was the right choice for them. Or maybe one of them decided to raise the child, and the other one said, "It's been real, see you later." Or maybe one of them got sick and died, and the other was left alone, or maybe they split up and had to figure out what that meant for them as parents. And the child was named Emmanuel, which means God with us. What would any of these new narratives mean for how you feel about yourself, your body, your sexuality, your life, about the holiness of who you are as you are? It's time for a new narrative that recognizes that God loves us, that God dwells with us and in us, not in spite of our humanity, but because of it. That it is what we see as the most ordinary about ourselves that is the most extraordinary, the most sacred. A new narrative that says that Mary is worthy of being revered because she was a woman who lived a hard life with grace and power and raised a child under the most perilous of circumstances. And that, praise God, in that she is not unique among women, but in the blessed company of so many women throughout time and into today. A new narrative that says what Jesus said by sitting down to eat with the most scandalous people of his day, that it is when the world most shames us that God is loving us the hardest and holding us the tightest. That it is each of us just as we are, that God loves so passionately that God cannot bear to be separated from us. God cannot bear to be separated from you. That none of us are disposable. And it's time we stop treating each other and ourselves like we are. It is time for a new narrative, a new way to tell a story that is worth keeping. A new story not of God avoiding what makes us human, but diving right into the heart of it. A new story where the miracle of Jesus' birth wasn't that it was different, but that it was the same, because every birth is miraculous, because every life is miraculous. A new song to sing about the birth of Jesus that begins, a child arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way. Amen.